The fault is great in man or woman who steals a goose from off a common. But what can plead that man's excuse who steals a common from a goose? Hello everyone, thanks for joining me this evening. Malcolm Noble welcoming you to the fourth in a series of podcasts for genealogists with too much time on their hands. As you can probably guess from that little rhyme at the beginning, which was taken from a petition to Parliament in the 1820s, this podcast is going to have something to do with the enclosure movement. If you remember in the last podcast, I said that I had already scripted a profile of the genealogist W E Tate. Well, guess what? The very next day, my one attentive listener came into my bookshop in Market Harbour and said, hey, come on, let's have that for the next one. So here we are then. This evening we're going to be talking about W E Tate.
Welcome to Family Trees Talk, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands, with Malcolm Noble.
Now, why do I think it's worth spending a few minutes on W E Tate? Well, he was, in many ways, I think, one of the fathers of the new interest in genealogy. He not only made it accessible to the ordinary reader, but he also caught the romance. And for example, in his book, The Parish Chest, he actually talks about the different types of chests that you're going to find and how they came to be. And he paints this lovely picture of the chests and their contents being pretty much ignored for centuries. And again, when he talks about parish registers, this sort of romance and love of history still comes through. And for me, that's very important. He's one of the people, that cluster of enthusiasts around about the end of the Second World War who popularised the hobby, but more importantly, made it accessible to the ordinary person. You didn't have to be a dusty old scholar to get involved. And W E Tate was very much of that school. He really was very much for the ordinary man. Now, some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I decided that I would put together a book collection of everything that W E Tate wrote. I soon went off that idea. I can tell you when I started to research just how much he did write. This guy wrote an awful lot, not just books, but papers and newspaper columns. In fact, I don't think that anybody will ever be able to make a complete list of all the stuff that he did write. But if anybody wants to produce a bibliography, well, they're going to have to start with Philippa's Personal Problem Corner. Yes, he was an agony aunt for his local paper, going under the name of Aunt Philippa. And then, of course, we got a whole plethora of local history pamphlets and articles that he wrote for different papers. Okay then, so what do we know about W E Tate? Well, it's ideal, you know, that for someone who gave so much to parish and village history, that he started his career as a village schoolmaster. He was the only teacher, so he was headmaster as well as caretaker at his local village school, and that meant that he had to teach everything. And he tells a very wonderful story about when he was trying to teach the girls how to do needlework, and of course they knew more about it than he did. But the real interest starts when he taught a more senior group of his pupils about the Enclosure Acts. And he relied on the lesson plan prepared by his predecessor. And he soon found out, actually, that there was just so many gaps in his knowledge. There were so many questions that he was asking himself about how did this happen, what was the process, and what was the effect on the ordinary people. Very much a W E Tate way of looking at things. And so that's what started his research, mainly in Nottinghamshire and particularly in Yorkshire. So if we can sort of say like the East Midlands and pushing up a little bit further north, that was his main stomping ground, if you like. But of course we're talking about, I suppose the late 1930s, certainly the war years. So, one, it's very expensive, and two, it's quite unusual. So when he went and asked for these old maps and these old documents and all the parchment work, people were a little bit taken aback. They couldn't understand why an ordinary individual would be interested in such things. But he soon made a name for himself, and eventually he was granted a scholarship as a senior scholar at Oxford University, and that's where he continued his work on the Enclosure Acts and the Enclosure movement, if you like, during the 17 and 1800s. Now, just to give some sort of balance, when he wrote much later his book on the English village community and the enclosure movements, this was published in 1967, so well towards the end of his life, there was a review of that book in the English Historical Review. The review was done by G.E. Mingay, and it was quite scathing. And I will just give you a couple of quotes from that review. The full review can be read on the show notes. I'll produce a link to it. W E Tate's last book is a general survey of the enclosure movements. This highly personal and somewhat eccentric volume is aimed primarily at readers whose acquaintance with this subject is slight. For the expert, there is very little in this book that is new and important. The historian, hoping for an authoritative and up-to-date assessment of the subject, will also be disappointed. The treatment of the 18th century is much fuller, but still falls far short of being a complete and balanced survey of the existing sources. I shall post a link to the complete review on the show notes to the page if you want to visit that. That is at talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. Now, there is a couple of things that I'd like to pull out of that review. For a start, it does show that W E Tate wasn't really part of the scholarly establishment. Yes, he'd been to a full-time student at Oxford University as a mature student, if you like, and he was well published in the field. He was well ensconced in the Society of Genealogists, but he was still a little bit of an outsider because his route into the game had not been traditional. And a little bit of that snobbishness, I suppose you say, comes out in that review.
You're listening to Family Trees Talk with Malcolm Noble.
And tonight we're talking about the work of W E Tate. I thought during the second half of this podcast we look at his two major works, the Parish Chest, which was published in 1946, and then his last book, which was the English Village Community and the Enclosure Movement.
talkgenealogy.wordpress.com.
Tate was much involved with the Workers' Education Association, which was really adult learning, if you like. And it was during the summer schools that some of his students came up to him and said, hey, you've been telling us all about these historical documents and the sources for local history. Is there not a textbook that brings it all together? And of course there wasn't. So Tate sat down and wrote one. And his passion for the subject certainly comes through in this book. Now, it has been through, well, let's say 3 editions. Actually, the 3rd edition was reprinted in the 1980s by Phillimore. And in each edition, you get a different preface. And while the Phillimore edition of the 3rd edition is certainly probably the most handsome of the different editions, it is printed on cheap paper, and the photographs don't reproduce as well in the 3rd edition as they did in the 1st and 2nd editions. So being a bit of an anorak, I would say that you need all 3 editions, but the text is absolutely the same in each of them. So perhaps there's no need for others to go quite that far. Now, the Parish Chest shows how Tate's work remains important today. Even in this digital age where everything is nicely catalogued and indexed and beautifully accessible, it is Tate's book that reminds us that all of that stuff on the internet actually draws down to a primary source, draws down to the original documents written over 100 years ago. Almost 200 years ago, most of it. He begins by taking us through a description of the English village in times gone by, and he sets it by saying, look, if a person from the Tudor or Stuart times came back to their village today, these are the differences that he would see in 1946. So actually, he's not only giving us a picture of village life in centuries gone by, he was also giving us a picture of the 1940s village, which of course today is of historical interest in itself. He then explains the parish chest, the physical parish chest in detail, and goes through not only the documents that you would have found in a parish chest, now of course they're all in the County Records Office, but he explains to us who wrote those documents, who would have read them, who would have used them, and the circumstances in which they would have came into being. And so we get a very acute impression of the vestry and the vestry officials and the parochial officials as they change over the years. He takes us through the church records, the church warden records, and we learn that he was a very important person, and the church warden's accounts, and then the poor relief documents, as well as, of course, the parish registers. Now, his chapters on the parish registers are very interesting, but of course, if you really want to explore the history of parish registers in England, you need to go to the book by John Sutherland Byrne, which again is on the show notes for tonight's episode. Written in 1802, would you believe? And he's talking about the history then. So he really just dips into what he found when he went and looked at the old parish registers of England. But it's a very nice book to read and to browse through. Okay, now turning to the second of Tate's classics, the last book he wrote, The English Village Community and the Enclosure Movement. Now, drawing on my history lessons at school, I had it in my head that the enclosure movement was something that happened in the first half of the 19th century. But what Tate's book has shown me is actually that that's been going on since medieval times and was going on in a different way through the different stages of English history. And there's this sort of continuity of development that comes through as we read the book. Perhaps the most interesting bit isn't about the enclosure movement, but is about the different field systems that were around in medieval times and Tudor times, and the different ways of managing a meadow from a strip farm and so on, and what the difference is between the different yearly rotations. And he also goes into detail about the different marks that we might find on a field in different parts of the country. So in spite of that appalling review that I read out to you earlier on, this is actually quite an essential book for anybody whose family has been in, let's say, one parish for 200 or 300 years. And that will be, a lot of us will be in that situation, because it actually shows the development of the management of the parish estate, if you like. And the little poem that I used at the beginning of this podcast is actually taken from the English Village Community and the Enclosure Movements. So there we have just two of the books that W E Tate wrote. And I have spent hours with this gentleman, and I still do. If I can't think of what book to read while I'm having my late night cocoa, I know that I can pick up the Parish Chest by W E Tate or the book on the English Village, and it's just like returning to an old friend. There's always seems to be something new, something quirky, something interesting in it.
Thank you for listening to Family Trees Talk, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands, with Malcolm Noble.
Well, there we go, ladies and gentlemen. Well done for sitting this out to the end. I am very sorry it's been all me burbling on this evening. I haven't had a guest. I'd like to thank Emily Brooks for the voiceover and Freeze Effects for the music. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to tonight's podcast. I shall be back again on the 3rd of each month with another chat for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. I hope that you'll be there to join me. Thank you for your support. So good night and God bless you. Bye.